This is Lois Whealey for Women Today and Yesterday. And today I'm going to be focusing on my own todays and yesterday. Today is June 29th, and I think everyone knows I'm very interested in history. So I was checking on what happened on June 29th in one of my books that gives a day-by-day account of history over the 365 days of the year. It turns out that today is the 250th anniversary, that's a long time ago, right, of something that happened in 1767. In 1767, the first real seeds of the American Revolution were planted, because that was the day that the English Parliament passed a law which was a tax on goods imported into the American colonies, including tea, right? And you remember that the angry colonists eventually threw boxes of tea overboard in Boston Harbor several years before the actual revolution broke out. But the passage of the Townshend Act in 1767 planted that seed that led to the American Revolution 250 years ago today. So now on to my own history, bits of my own history. Matt has kindly photoed a number of pictures from my life that I've kept over the years, and some maps and that sort of thing that I hope will make it clearer to you. I was born in New York City on June 20th, 1932, and simple math will tell you that I just had my 85th birthday. We moved to Nevada when I was still so young I couldn't walk. I was 9 months old in March of 1933 when we left the state of New York and moved to Nevada, to southern Nevada, about halfway between Las Vegas, which is right down there at the very bottom of Nevada, and Death Valley, which is just over the line there in California. It was a place called Pahrump. And what you see here on the map is Nye County. Nye County was my home for basically the first 8 years or so of my life, because we lived in various places in Nye County at that time. Pahrump is down there very close to Las Vegas, as it shows on the map. Actually, it's about 60 miles from Pahrump to Las Vegas, but in the days when we lived there, there wasn't any direct route. You had to go around Spring Mountains, and it was 100 miles to Las Vegas, which is pretty far, especially for those old-time cars back in 1934 or thereabouts. But we also see a map here of Nevada, which shows U.S. Highway 50. Anybody here heard of U.S. Highway 50? Well, of course. It runs right through Athens, Ohio. And U.S. Highway 50 enters Nevada on the east, there from Utah, near Ely, Nevada, and is often called the Loneliest Road, simply because it's so far between places in Nevada on U.S. Route 50. Fallon, Nevada, see, there's my t-shirt. It says, "I survived U.S. 50." And that line across shows from Ely to Eureka to on to Fallon, which is closer to the west side, the left side of the picture, and Carson City, the state capital, which is just under the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then actually US 50 goes up to Lake Tahoe and goes around the southern part of beautiful, beautiful Lake Tahoe, where I was lucky enough to spend 8 summers as a child. So, US 50, connecting Athens with Fallon, Nevada in particular, where my brother still lives on the ranch that my parents bought during World War II, and which is actually quite close to a U.S. Naval Air Station, because during the Second World War there were a lot of bases built up in Nevada to take advantage of good flying weather and being far away from the West Coast, where there was a fear of maybe something happening like Japanese attacks on the West Coast. And that's where I grew up. First of all, in Pahrump, and I think we're going to have some pictures of Pahrump coming up soon. It was an oasis in the desert. Pahrump Valley is shown in this drawing, which is on the back of a booklet that I have here, which has a number of pictures of Pahrump in it. And since I helped the man who wrote the, the booklet and provided him with some pictures that came from Pahrump, you'll see them. This is a picture of my mother, Lois Elizabeth Hatch Dymel Washburn. This was taken when she was Lois Washburn and represented Nye County and parts of, a large part of Nevada at the 1936 Democratic Convention in Philadelphia. This picture was taken at that time. In the fall, she ran for the Nevada legislature, and she became the only woman in the Nevada House in 1937. We also have a picture of my father, George. This is my father, Daddy Ed, Edgar Bertram Dymel. This is a studio portrait that was taken in New York City before we left for Nevada. And actually, I remember him, but pretty vaguely, because he died when I was only 5 years old. So, but both of those people were at Pahrump, and they were the people in charge there of a large, well, they made it into a kind of a dude ranch, but it was a big place that had fields of alfalfa and so on. Later on, they left actually in 1937 from Pahrump. Now maybe, okay, here's a picture of the man who wrote that booklet about Pahrump, Denny Lynch. You know, back in the 1980s, I was on the Athens and the Tri-County school boards. And in 1986, I went to Nevada, to Las Vegas, to the National School Boards Convention that was being held there at the time. That was, I gave a paper actually about community schools, because we were quite interested in the connection between the school district and the schools and the community of Athens and the other parts of the Athens County District, including Chauncey and the Plains. And in 1986, I took a trip from Las Vegas actually up to Reno, where I met my daughter Alice, who was a student at Stanford University at the time. And she came up, she had spring break, luckily then. We took a trip into my past in the state of Nevada, not only Reno, but to Carson City, where my mother had been a state legislator in 1937, to Fallon, Nevada on US 50, where my brother Bill still lives, and down to Hawthorne, where we lived during the Second World War. My mother taught there. She also worked for a time at the naval base in Hawthorne, which was an ammunition depot. The reason being that the huge ammunition depot that had been built in New Jersey and was used, I think, during the First World War, suffered a terrible explosion in the late 1920s. And I guess they decided, hey, maybe we ought to build the ammunition storage for the Navy a little closer to the West Coast and in an area which is not so likely to be hit by an explosion. So they did build up Hawthorne on Walker Lake in the shade of beautiful Mount Grant, and we lived there for 3 years during the war. Then we went on to Tonopah, which is the county seat of Nye County, and I lived there for 3 years during the late 1930s. It's just about right at where you see that crook in the arm there of Nye County, that biggest county. That's the biggest county. That was the second biggest county in the whole United States in the 1930s, and all the way up till the time when Alaska joined the Union, of course, later on in the century there. But we lived in Tonopah, like I say, and there are some pictures of Pahrump and of Tonopah that we'll be seeing here in a minute. Denny Lynch was the one who wrote this booklet. That's a picture of him when he was a young fella. He told me when I met him in 1936, I met him in 1986 by talking to him on the phone after I had bought his book called About Pahrump, because he moved, he was born in West Virginia, just nearby, a neighbor state of ours, just down there in the southern part of West Virginia, and actually in the same little town where Pearl Buck was born. And that shows him as a young man. He was playing in New York City at the time that I was developing, actually. He was playing in New York City in 1931 when I was just sort of a future person, you might say, my mother's womb. And there's another picture of him which shows him as an old gent in Las Vegas about 1990. Yeah, 1990. He had lived in Pahrump for a number of years and written this book about Pahrump, and I pointed out to him that he left out of his book any mention of my parents, who were there for 4 years in the 1930s, and I had these pictures. So the pictures you saw of my mother and of my father were featured in his book, and some pictures of me as a little kid. There I am as a really, really little kid, very shortly after we moved to Pahrump from New York City. I'm sitting there on a step of a shacky house. I mean, you know, like you'd see back in the 1930s, enjoying my bath, I guess, there. And then there are some other pictures of me. There's the one this was the picture that showed me that I had gotten to Pahrump in 1986, because those buildings in the background are still there. And there I am running toward the camera at about age 2, I guess, over there on the left with my sunbonnet on, and no doubt I'm barefoot, because I went barefoot for so many years and so many summers in Nevada that I still have feet like leather. And there is Pahrump store. It's still there. The store in 1986, when Alice and I visited, was actually a sort of a goodwill place. But it was still there. And I guess it had been built about, maybe 1910 or thereabouts. There is a picture at Pahrump. The lady on the horse on the right is my mother, Lois Whealey, as she was then. And interestingly, I didn't recognize her. It's kind of hard to recognize women who are wearing big hats and mostly on horses, and you mostly just see the horse. But when I showed this picture to a friend that I still have from Pahrump days, who was once a student of my mother's when she was in second grade, and her name was Clarabelle Jim, and she still lives in Las Vegas. She's a very old lady now, in her early 90s, but she was in my mother's school class at Pahrump. And she was the one who said, "Oh, no, that's your mother. That's your mother." I hadn't recognized her with her big hat on. And there are some other pictures of us at Pahrump. There I am with the boy who became my cousin when my Uncle Worth married my Aunt Alicia. She became after she married him. But she had been married before, and that's Jim Wallace, who was my first great friend, because Alicia Wallace had visited at Pahrump in 1935, and I believe that picture shows us on horseback there in 1935, Jim Wallace and the little Loisita or Dolly Whealey. Most of my family still call me Dolly. I'm Cousin Dolly to a whole bunch of cousins who are related to my mother, of course. And there we are. That one is definitely from 1935. Me with Jim, who's a couple of years older than me, and me in my starting to get small dress that I was photographed in, as it happens, in 1934, and I found the evidence of that when I saw a picture that you'll be seeing later, me in the same dress with my mother in 1934 in Los Angeles. But this is at Pahrump, of course. Here we see Tonopah, Nevada, the county seat of Nye County. The big building in the right in the middle there is the Tonopah School that was in use at the time I was there. I went to second and third grades there, and way up on the hill in the background, Mount Bruffer, is my house. I don't think you can, yeah, there it is. I wrote up a story about my early days in Tonopah, which was printed long ago in the Central Nevada Historical Society newsletter, and they put an arrow pointing down to my house on the top row of houses on Eureka Street in Tonopah, and you can see the school even closer there. And just up the hill above my house a little ways, don't believe it shows up too well on that picture, is the T for Tonopah. Many of the western towns have whitewashed rocks made into a big capital letter for the name of their town, and then we lived right under the T for Tonopah for several years, actually. Now let's see what comes next. Okay, another picture of Tonopah. Now the interesting thing about this is those, if you can see it, maybe on a larger TV screen than we have here, maybe closer to you, it's actually made of bottles. They didn't have much lumber out there in the desert, but they had plenty of bottles, for sure. And this house was built out of bottles back in the early days of Tonopah being a mining town for silver. Actually, silver was found there in May 1900, and just by chance, my son David and I visited Tonopah and were looking through the museum on the very 100th anniversary day of the discovery of silver in the place that became Tonopah by Jim Butler. And within a couple of months of May 1900, the town of Tonopah grew up because, of course, there were always rushes. There were gold rushes and silver rushes. In Nevada, they were almost always silver rushes, but there was a silver rush to Nevada in Tonopah in May of 1900, after May of 1900, and it quickly sprang up. And as I say, I lived there second grade, third grade in Tonopah, in Nye County, and elsewhere in Nye County besides Pahrump. This is a town on Route 50. This is the town of Fallon, Nevada, and way in the background there's you can just barely see a building with a little steeple on it kind of thing, a bell. Actually, the bell, I think, was a warning for a fire in the early days, because that's the Churchill County courthouse in the background. The cars in the front that you see there, my mom had a car just like that one that you see the back of there. And the fronts looked very much like the front you see on the other side. It had a trunk, which was not under the back seats like they are nowadays, but the trunk, you know, stood out from the frame of the car, from the main part of the cab of the car. And my mother had a Chrysler that looked just like that one in the front, and we used it to travel back and forth from Fallon to Hawthorne during World War II, until a terrible accident happened to that car. Unbelievable. But it was covered by insurance, as it happens. That car in the mid-40s was in Reno, in a garage right next to the Truckee River, which passes from Lake Tahoe through Reno and ends up in Pyramid Lake in Nevada. And the car was there in the garage on the Truckee River when there was a flash flood. And the car was in an underground garage. I mean, you know, like a basement kind of place right next to the river. So that was the end of the car, finally. Well, we lived in Tonopah and Fallon, and we'll be seeing some more pictures around the state of Nevada, I believe. Well, this is some distance away. Now we're going to be looking at pictures from my family. Oh, I just had it redone. I had a beautiful redoing of the picture because the frame had gotten all loose and was coming apart. The glass or plexiglass covering it had holes in it and so forth. And so I've just had it redone at Lamborn's. And this is a picture of me with my daughter. And at the time is Easter, 1964. And it was just before we moved to Athens, Ohio, which we did in the fall of 1964. But this is Maine. This is University Park near Orono, Maine, when my husband was teaching history at the University of Maine. She was born, Alice was born in Bangor, which is about 15 miles south of Orono, but also on the big Penobscot River that flows into the Atlantic, and very nice place, you know, good spot to get lobsters and so on, which is a real Maine specialty there. Let's see what else we've got. There's a picture of my daughter Alice when she was about 7, and she's wearing a dress that her Aunt Gwen sent. Aunt Gwen had made the dress originally for her sister. She was the oldest of 5 sisters, and she had made the dress for her sister, who was quite young, because my brother is 10 years younger than me, and Gwen was a little younger than he was, and then she had all these younger sisters. That was a pretty dress, and it was made from a dress that had been my first evening gown that my mother made for me when I was a freshman in high school at the high school for Mineral County in Hawthorne, Nevada. Who else do we have here? There's my son Dick. He's about 12 there, I would say, so that was taken in the 1970s. He was just entering kindergarten when we moved to Athens, and he was attending kindergarten right here in this building, because this building was Morrison School, and we were living in the Morrison School District when we first came to Athens, Ohio. Who have we got next? Well, this goes back a ways for sure, because there's my brother on the right, and you can tell he's only about 12 or so himself there. This is a picture taken at Lake Tahoe, which shows my husband. I took the picture. I'm not in it, obviously. I just about didn't get my new husband, Bob, but he's the fellow with the sunglasses all the way over on the left. And then there's my mother, Lois Washburn, and my stepfather, George Washburn. And that was taken during the trip that we took to meet for my new husband. We'd been married about a year by then, well, 6 months or so. We went west to meet my folks. He'd never met my folks. I met his folks because they lived on the East Coast and were able to come to our wedding in July of 1954. Okay, let's see who else. Well, there we are. Bob was running for Congress in 1972, so he's all dressed up with a shirt and tie. I don't think I've seen him in a tie in about a dozen years now. And there's a picture of me. We were on the trail. I believe it was taken in McConnellsville, actually, because the 10th District, as it was in those days, held by Clarence Miller, was including Morgan County and McConnellsville. Okay, there we are, and there I am in that dress that you saw later on at Pahrump. I was not sure when this was taken, and I put the wrong date on the back. It was actually taken in 1934 when I was 2 years old, and we were visiting in Los Angeles. And there I am with my mother, Lois Dimel, and I'm Dolly Dimel, and after howling about having my hair cut and having to put on a fancy dress and so forth and so on, and having to sit on a bench near my mom, finally the photographer got me to smile by holding up a mitten that looked like a kitten. And so I have a nice big smile there, in spite of everything. This is a picture that shows the family people. The little head down at the bottom is my oldest son, Dick, when he was about a year old. We were in Northern Virginia, and the people in order: my Aunt Alicia, my Uncle Shelley Krasno, my Uncle Worth, the sort of tall man right in the middle. Bob comes next, and then my Aunt Alice, my mother's sister, and they are entertaining Dickie when he was about a year old in Fairfax, Virginia. This is my son, David. Many of you may have met David, who has worked for many years at College Bookstore. This picture was taken, I believe, when he was a freshman at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Here is the family at 14 Oak Street, where we still live. This was taken in 1972 when Bob was running for Congress. He's up on the porch. I'm seated on the steps. On the left is David, who would have been almost 12 then, 11, I guess he was 11. Our daughter Alice, who was born in 63, so she would have been 9. And on the bottom step, our oldest son, Dick, the one who went to Morrison School when we first came to Athens. And here is my Uncle Mike and Aunt Marianne. They were honorary uncles and aunts and dear old friends of my parents. And they were holding not one of my kids, but one of his great nephews, I believe. Now we have a family picture. This was not a happy occasion, but funerals attract the family for sure, and this picture was taken by me when George Washburn, my beloved stepfather, was buried in California in 1971. Well, he was actually buried on January 1st, 1972, and that's when this picture dates from, with my brother way in the back there, and cousins and uncles and aunts who are still with us but are all grown up, and most of the ones that are grown up there are now passed on, of course. There I am. I think that picture was taken in 1974, if I'm not mistaken, but it was taken here in Athens quite a long time ago, over 40 years ago, obviously. This was taken in Maine, when we still lived in Maine, with Dickie in the background and David in the foreground. They're enjoying the snow because, of course, there was plenty of snow in Maine. And in fact, there was such a terrible snowstorm at one point that our little VW Bug was not even a bump, because there had been 4 feet of snow in one fall. But that was just in January of 1963, before our daughter Alice was born. This is an earlier time. There wasn't quite that much snow the year that this was taken. This is a picture of Bob's dad and Bob. Bob is a little guy there. I'm not sure, maybe about 3. But of course, he grew up in New York State, out on Long Island in Baldwin, New York. And I imagine that this was taken somewhere near Baldwin, but I don't know for sure. With the next picture showing my mother-in-law, Ethel Ann Rooney Whealey. She's holding Dick as a tiny baby for the first time. He was born in 1959, and we moved from Ann Arbor, where he was born, to Washington, D.C. area so that Bob could do research, and so that made it easy for us to get to Delaware, where Bob's parents lived for a number of years after retiring from New York State. Here's Bob and me, and we're, I think this is, well, I know that it's in England. It was during the year we were in England in 1956-57, when Bob was a student at Oxford University. This is in Fallon, Nevada. My stepfather, George Washburn, on the left, me in the middle, Dolly, and on the right, my bare-chested younger brother, Bill Washburn, who was about, 16, I guess, at the time. No, maybe a little older. My mother died of cancer in 1959, and I went out for a while with my new baby at that time. She had a chance to play piggy toes on his toes. But Bill was a senior in high school at the time. And this was probably the following summer when I went out for a couple of months to help out with doing the cooking while my dad and brother were haying the alfalfa fields out there in Nevada. Right on US 50, used to run right by our door, as a matter of fact. Here I am, and I'm wearing my Hello Dolly t-shirt. When Hello Dolly was put on at the Athens High School, and I was on the school board, I think I did the only time I ever really leaned on a teacher to ask Carol Patterson if she would make a t-shirt. The whole cast was having t-shirts that said Hello Dolly on them. And of course I gave her money for it. But it says Hello Dolly, and I found that a rather nice shirt to wear when I visited cousins. I'm holding 2 Indian baskets. You can't see that very well in the picture, of course. But those 2 Indian baskets came from Pahrump, where there was an old lady, Whispering Ben's wife. She was probably born about the time that Nevada became a state in 1864, because the basket she made at Pahrump was made in the 1930s, and she was a very elderly lady by then, at least 70 years old, which would have been the case in the 1930s. Okay, well, here's what we look like today, me and my fellas. This was taken during our dinner, after dinner, after we'd enjoyed dinner at Somam restaurant. And you see my husband, Bob Whealey, Robert Howard Whealey, my son, David John Whealey, and my grandson, Reese Janeson Whealey. And that was my 85th birthday anniversary dinner. So there are a bunch of pictures of us over the years and in different places from around Nevada, especially from Nye County. Nye was named for the territorial governor of the state of Nevada. And of course, he was from the east. And he took with him to Nevada a man named Clemens. This man named Clemens served as a secretary to Governor Nye, and Clemens' brother also came to Nevada and became a famous writer by serving first on the Territorial Enterprise newspaper in Virginia City, and he's better known to literature as Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. So there are always these connections, places and people with history that help us to understand the world today and hope for better things, probably, hopefully, in the future as well. So that's a bit of that story from Nevada. Now, I'm not sure whether Matt has some further pictures or not. So I brought something that I thought might be of interest for you to hear. It was something that I wrote while I was still on the school board in Athens and at Tri-County Vocational School. And it's called Thoughts on Being a Team Player. I wrote this in 1989. The voters turned me loose that November, but this was while I was still on the school board. Shortly after being elected to the school board in Athens, Ohio, 6 years ago, I attended a training conducted for new board members by the Ohio School Boards Association and heard the first of many admonitions about the importance of being a team player. The 5-member school board teams up with the superintendent. Other district teams are in each building's instructional team and the management team of district administrators of the schools. Ideally, the school board team focuses on policy, recognizing that the management team does the day-to-day running of the schools, while the instructional team does the actual classroom teaching. This sounds straightforward enough, and both the OSBA and the National School Boards Association use the team analogy often. At one school district in-service for administrators and school board, OSBA presented a chart depicting 3 intersecting pyramids labeled instructional team, management team, and policy team. The instructional team, the lowest or most basic, had its top point, the principal, stuck into the next team up, the management team. This team is headed by the superintendent, of course, who is also stuck into the policy team on which the board members play. But wait a minute, please. Time out. Some basic questions need to be asked and hopefully answered. 1. Just what is the game the teams are playing? 2. Is the game more like football, basketball, baseball, soccer, relay racing, or some other sport? 3. Who is the coach? Who is the captain? Who calls the plays? 4. Who is the opponent? 5. How does one score, and how are star players identified? The answers to these questions will differ depending on whether one is talking to a board member, a superintendent, a principal, a teacher, a student, a parent, a state legislator, or a voter taxpayer. Many don't even realize there's a game going on. Despite unanswered and perhaps unanswerable questions, there are good features to the team model. Number 1, it can get away from autocratic rule by the superintendent or by the board. This last, that is, autocratic rule by the board, is, like the dragon, more mythological than a real beast, but one still deeply feared by superintendents and other professionals. 2, a management team may be able to get away somewhat from the isolated school building run as an autonomous kingdom by its principal, or possibly by its teachers, or maybe the active parents. When playing this team game, even the name of which is unknown, school board members must watch out lest they discover, number 1, that the team concept provides an opportunity for administrators to preempt the authority of the elected board. 2, that the administrative team structure encourages de facto collective bargaining by administrators eager to increase their salaries or other perks. And finally, how does managing differ from controlling a ball? Often controlling the ball means futilely passing it back and forth among the players with no one ever getting close enough to actually score. The team runs to and fro. The enemy does not have the ball, but little is accomplished. How about scrapping the hierarchical team for a network model where board, administrators, teachers, and learners play together? Whatever the team and whatever the game, success will depend on striving for the goal. The goal is improved learning by the district's children. Thought you might find that of interest. Souvenir of my days on the school board. Here's another thing that I wrote, also about 20 years ago, a long time ago. This is a religious thought that was published in the Universalist Herald. I'm a Unitarian Universalist and have been for many years. I first became a Unitarian when we lived in Maine, and our daughter Alice, when she was 1 year old, was in the Unitarian tradition, dedicated, not baptized. But the Universalist Herald speaks to me because one of the things that I learned very nicely for me by doing genealogy was discovering that my Ohio great-great-grandparents were Universalists. They were Universalists living near New Albany in Franklin County back in the 19th century. And there's an old Universalist church just over the county line in Licking County on that road that connects the upper part of Franklin County with Newark in Licking County. Anyway, this thought is about Psalm 23 and how Psalm 23 restores us too. When Jesus entered Jerusalem in triumph on the first Palm Sunday 2 millennia ago, the words of his ancestor David's 23rd Psalm were already 1,000 years old. Why is this the most popular song in the Bible? Can it speak to modern Unitarian Universalists? I believe this ageless psalm is still relevant for us. Intensely personal, its simple words reflect a deep faith in a nurturing God. This is not a God of majesty, punishment, or battles, but a restorer of souls who is everything and is both feminine and masculine at the same time. In nature, God is pictured as the good shepherd providing comfort and protection. Within the house, God is addressed intimately like the eternal hostess, liberally serving and honoring her anointed one. Ironically, the Scottish Psalter's rhyming version of the 23rd Psalm was published in 1650 in the middle of a bloody civil war in Britain, in which religion played a key role. The Stuart King Charles I had been beheaded the previous year, so the Scots were in arms against Parliament and its army. In September 1650, a terrible defeat was inflicted by Cromwell's forces on the Scots at Dunbar. May we, who also live in a time of troubles, act rightly and experience goodness and mercy all the days of our lives. And when we walk in the valley of the shadow, as we surely will, may we be reassured by the positive faith of David's 3,000-year-old song. Psalm 23. I call myself a Christian humanist as a Unitarian Universalist, so that means something to me for sure. Well, those are a couple of things that I wrote a long time ago, and here's something else. I think this is a bit long to read, but it's an interesting idea. You know, this is 2017, and 40 years ago, when I was president of the Athens branch of the American Association of University Women, I updated something which I had written 10 years earlier, because our branch, Athens AAUW branch, which I'm happy to say is beginning to flourish again nicely, was founded in 1927 here in Athens, Ohio. So what I did was I went back to the 10-year interval since 1927. And for instance, for the year 1927, I mentioned that Irma E. Voigt, Dean of Women at Ohio University, was president of Athens branch AAUW when President of the United States Calvin Coolidge played on the politics of food by vetoing legislation passed by Congress supposedly to aid farmers, pointing out that it would encourage overproduction, raise prices of food at home, while the same products would be sold more cheaply abroad. That was one of the items from 1927. Well, what were Athenians humming that year, 1927? I'm sure they must have had some songs from Edna Ferber's Showboat. 1927 was the year that Showboat opened on Broadway, and it still has a lot of popular songs that old-timers like to hear occasionally. Although mostly we're hearing modern-day music for sure. But 1927 was the year that Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. And the electronic arts were born. The first experimental television demonstration included Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover on a 2.5-inch square screen. That was an experimental TV, indeed. Nowadays, people are glad to have a huge screen that's maybe 5 feet across. Also, the day after the branch's first meeting on October 5th, 1927, the Talkies premiered, because that was the year that talking pictures came to be. Before that, the movies had been silent, and they would be accompanied by music frequently, to sort of, something that would kind of go along with what you were viewing on the screen. Talkies premiered with Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer. So it was a very good idea that they had talking pictures where they could also have musical sound. Secretary of State Kellogg was readying the most radical document ever signed by the world's nations, an agreement outlawing war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, which included signatures, many of the signatures from Europe. After all, World War I was only 10 years in the past in 1927, because 1917 was the year that the United States entered World War I. So, looking back at these things in the past, you can see that a lot of what happened then is still relevant today. Ohio University in 27 was accepted as the 250th institution whose graduates were eligible to become members of AAUW. And that had to happen before Dean Voigt could get an Athens branch of AAUW, which he had been working on for about 5 years. She wrote a pageant called the McGuffey Review, which money that they raised by that went to the National Fellowships Fund of American Association of University Women, which still proudly supports women who are working, mostly women who are working on their college advanced degrees. So, this is a time when I've been remembering with you, and with my necklace spread out before me here that shows events from my life. This goes all the way from the good luck that I had to move to Nevada and so on, and to be born in the first place, and my mother's wedding ring, all the way out here to my 40th wedding anniversary. We're coming on 63 this weekend. This is Lois Whealey for Women Today and Yesterday.